go ahead and begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to listen to Jalyn's presentation over the controversies surrounding raw milk consumption. Jalyn started her master's in 2022 here at Mississippi State University, and she focused on the gut microbiome differences between healthy versus diuretic calves. And then in 2024, she began her PhD under Dr. Fan, focusing on microbiome, cow behavior, and then the addition of stimulus to the cow's environment, which is super cool. Jalyn's fun fact is that between her and her cat, whose name is Popeye, they have 2 good eyes. So if you're ever walking with Jalyn, make sure to walk on her left side, or else she will run into you. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jalyn Hawkins to share some more about the raw milk controversy.
Thank you, Allison.
Raw milk is amazing because raw milk is superior to pasteurized milk. Raw milk is packed with probiotics.
Raw milk is trended, but is it safe?
In the 1800s, milk was linked to deadly diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid fever, scarlet fever, and diphtheria. In crowded cities such as Chicago, New York, and Boston, infant mortality reached up to 36%. Part of the cause was not understood until the late 1800s when Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that microorganisms cause disease. Their discovery led to pasteurization, in which milk is heated to destroy harmful pathogens and viruses, making it safe to drink. Today, raw milk advocates claim that pasteurization removes probiotics and nutrients, but pasteurized milk still contains those essential nutrients, and probiotics are easily obtained from yogurt and other fermented dairy products. Despite these claims, raw milk still carries high risk. Contamination can come from various sources, including cow health, hygiene, laborers, and milking equipment. Studies also show that pasteurized milk feeding in pre-weaned calves improves their growth and reduces illness. More research is needed to explore potential benefits and further reduce contamination of raw milk. But until then, pasteurized milk remains the safest choice, protecting both animal and human health in every drop.
Raw milk is amazing because raw milk is superior to pasteurized.
Okay. All right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so milk is essential and unique in the human diet. Not only does it start as our first food, but for many of us, it never leaves the table. Now, it's surprising to think that this everyday food staple was once the cause of so many deadly diseases. This time period was referred to as the milk question in the United States, where during the 1800s, the infant mortality rates reached up to 36%. Now, one of the major causes of this was from contaminated milk, which caused diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid and scarlet fever, diphtheria, and cholera infantum, also known as summer diarrhea. Now, at the time, disease was thought to just spontaneously occur, and it wasn't until the 1860s when Louis Pasteur, with support from other scientists like Robert Koch, published the germ theory, which proposed that diseases were caused by specific microorganisms. This then led to his creation, the pasteurizer, in 1865, which was actually created to prevent the spoilage of wines and alcohols. It wasn't until the 1870s when pasteurization was first applied to raw cow's milk, and this was also around the time when cow's milk was first linked to tuberculosis and typhoid fever. Now, pasteurization was not immediately accepted throughout the nation or throughout the world, as many physicians argued that raw milk was used to treat certain childhood illnesses. This then led to Dr. Henry Coit establishing the American Association for Medical Milk Commissions, which ensured that dairy farms were producing milk under proper veterinary care and under high sanitation standards. However, raw milk outbreaks were still occurring, with some even linking back to these certified dairies. So in 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered a study on milk hygiene. Then in 1909, the United States Public Health Service endorsed pasteurization throughout the nation, and Chicago became the first major city to mandate pasteurization for all retail milk. Then about 3 decades later, after the first city mandate, Michigan became the first state to require that all retail milk be pasteurized. Now, the only federal law regarding raw milk regulations was in 1987, in which the Food and Drug Administration banned all interstate sales of raw milk. However, this year in April, the FDA suspended its proficiency testing program for grade A milk and milk products. And this program ensured that laboratories were accurately testing milk for its safety and quality. Now, this suspension is linked to a cost-cutting campaign led by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has also publicly advocated to end the aggressive suppression of raw dairy. Now you may be wondering, why are people favoring raw milk again? Well, raw milk advocates like to tell us to look further back into history, reminding us that humans have been consuming raw cow's milk for over 6,000 years. But during this time, humans were most likely consuming this milk very fresh and from individual or small dairy herds where disease risks were minimal. Now, some people believe that the Industrial Revolution has changed humans' relationship with raw cow's milk. And so during this time, breastfeeding rates declined as more women were entering the workforce, which then increased the consumption of raw cow's milk for infants and children. This increase in demand then led to an increase in dairy farm sizes, which were originally around 50 cows per farm, but increased to up to 2,000 cows per dairy farm. In addition to this, the farms, as well as many homes that were receiving this raw milk, did not have adequate refrigeration, and so any microbes present in the milk were able to multiply more efficiently. Now, some of the microbial culprits that are common in contaminating raw milk include the bacterial pathogens, Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Brucella abortus, which are not as common in America today, but we are more familiar with Salmonella species as well as Escherichia coli, or more specifically, the Shiga toxin-producing E. coli strain. There's also Listeria monocytogenes as well as Campylobacter species. Now, bacterial pathogens are not the only microbial culprits when it comes to contaminating milk, as viruses can also be present in raw milk, such as hepatitis A and norovirus, which are also not as common today, but within the past 2 years, bird flu, or the H5N1 virus, has been infecting the dairy industry, and it is said to be most easily transmitted through raw milk. Now, I wanted to point out that the immediate raw milk product is not inherently bad, but instead it can be easily contaminated by many environmental sources, the first and most common being the producer herself. And so any pathogens from mastitis, as well as from any feces, if she has any digestive upsets, could lead to milk contamination. There's also milking equipment like the milking cloths if they're not properly sanitized in between individual cows, as well as laborers who are not properly being hygienic during the milking shifts, or if they've traveled to other farms and did not properly quarantine themselves before returning to the farms in which they were employed. There's also housing, or more specifically bedding. So if they're not kept clean, some cows could be subjected to lying in their feces or urine for long periods of time, which can lead to contamination. And then lastly, the processing plant can also contaminate milk, but contamination in the processing plant is more common when it comes to making and aging cheeses. Now, just a small amount of contamination can be detrimental when it comes to certain groups of people. The CDC reported that the risks of illness are 840 times higher in raw milk compared to pasteurized milk, and those who are more vulnerable to these illnesses include children that are younger than 5 years of age, elderly adults that are 65 years and older, women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, and individuals with chronic conditions, and that can include anyone with asthma, autoimmune diseases, diabetes, and cancer. Now, as of last year, the American population was estimated to be around 340 million people. And so looking at just the age demographic, as well as pregnant or breastfeeding women, that only makes up about 25% of the population. However, if you were to look into individuals that were diagnosed with at least one chronic condition, that makes up over half of the population at around 62%. But even though there is a large portion of America that is more vulnerable to illnesses caused from contaminated raw milk, its popularity is still increasing. And so in addition to the potential health benefits of raw milk, its popularity could also be attributed to the public's distrust of the government, as well as it being a symbol of freedom and natural living. Now, this increased popularity hasn't just changed consumers' opinions, but it has also changed policies. And so since 2016, raw milk sales have gone from being illegal in 13 states to now only 2 states, which includes New Jersey and Hawaii. And some people have attributed this shift to the post-COVID-19 pandemic, where consumers are more wanting to consume more natural and less processed foods, as well as wanting to stay away from highly industrialized food systems. Now, some of the most popular influencers or raw milk advocates include the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who I mentioned earlier. There's also Hannah Nealman, who's the creator of the famous TikTok account Ballerina Farms, in which she promotes living a traditional homestead lifestyle based in Utah. She's also recently come under even more popularity with the launch of their new farmer protein powder, which includes raw bovine colostrum. Now, lastly, in response to this growing popularity, Netflix has created an episode titled Milk Money in their docuseries Rotten, in which they highlight certain dairy farms and producers that are producing and directly selling raw milk to consumers. Now, one of the largest, most popular farms that does this is Raw Farm, previously known as Organic Pastures. And so this farm is a pasture-based Jersey farm in California. And between the years 2006 and 2016, they did have 8 publicized outbreaks in which many children did become sick and some were diagnosed with hemolytic urea syndrome. And so this syndrome is caused by the Shiga toxin-producing E. coli strain previously mentioned, and this syndrome affects the red blood cells and it can severely damage your kidneys. Some are damaged for life. Now, Organic Pastures, did rebrand in 2020 as Raw Farm, but since then they have had additional raw milk outbreaks, including Salmonella in 2023, as well as E. coli and bird flu in 2024. Now, this company, along with many other companies, claim that pasteurization inactivates all of the enzymes in milk, it destroys the probiotics, alters the fats and protein concentrations, it destroys the vitamins, and then it inhibits calcium. But there is research that shows that not all of these claims are 100% accurate. But before I get into the research, I would like to briefly introduce some of the most common types of pasteurization. And so the first being low temp, long time, also known as batch pasteurization. And so this type of pasteurization, milk is heated to 63 degrees Celsius for around 30 minutes. And this is said to increase the refrigerated shelf life of raw milk to up to 2 weeks, as opposed to raw milk, which typically lasts only around 7 days. However, this form of pasteurization is probably the least common, as it does take more time, so it is less efficient compared to the other 2 types of pasteurization. Now, high temperature short time pasteurization is the most common that you'll see today. So the milk that you're buying in your local grocery stores in the dairy section is most likely this type of pasteurization, where milk is heated to around 72 degrees Celsius for 15 seconds. And the refrigerated shelf life is extended to up to 3 weeks. And then lastly, there's ultra high temperature pasteurization, where milk is heated to 138 degrees Celsius for around 2 seconds. And this milk is not required to be refrigerated. And once open, the shelf life can last up to 3 months. However, this form of pasteurization is also not as common because consumers have reported a powdery or burnt taste when it comes to this type of pasteurization. And so when milk is heated to 72 degrees Celsius, which is the most common or normal type of pasteurization, some enzymes are affected, but not all of them. And so two examples that I provided that are heat stable and not affected at 72 degrees Celsius include plasmin, which breaks down proteins within the milk, as well as superoxide dismutase, which acts as an antioxidant. Now, there are some enzymes that are partially inactivated, which include lactoperoxidase, which is also said to be antibacterial and act as an antioxidant, but it's also used as an indicator of over-pasteurization. As scientists have stated, if this enzyme is fully inactivated, then that means that the pasteurization was either at too high of temperatures or it lasted too long. Excuse me. There's also cathepsin D, which is also partially inactivated, and it also aids in breaking down proteins within the milk. And then lastly, some enzymes that are fully inactivated when it comes to normal pasteurization include alkaline phosphatase, and this is also used as an indicator of proper pasteurization. So if this enzyme is fully inactivated, then that lets scientists and processing plants know that they accurately pasteurize the milk to the recommended temperatures, which most likely would kill all of those harmful pathogens. And then there's also lipoprotein lipase, which is responsible for the breakdown of fat globules within the milk. Now, moving on to probiotics. The purpose of pasteurization is to remove harmful microbes, but it does end up removing a majority, if not all, of the microbes that are present within the raw milk. Now, a study in 2020 found that lactobacillus and bifidobacterium probiotics were enriched in the guts of adults that consumed raw milk for 9 weeks. However, the participants of this study also reported an increased fermented dairy product consumption like yogurt, and this is a major source of these lactic acid bacteria. In addition to this, the participants were also relocated to a rural setting, which was near the farm in which they were receiving this raw milk. And so environmental changes can also lead to shifts in the gut microbiota. I also want to point out that bifidobacterium is said to not be a naturally abundant bacteria that is present in raw milk, and instead is an indicator of fecal contamination. And so anyone saying that bifidobacterium is an essential probiotic that you can get from raw milk may be misleaded. But to address the lack of probiotics in pasteurized milk, some brands like Good Culture have begun fortifying pasteurized milk with certain probiotics to further aid in gut health. Now, fortification is also done in vitamins, specifically vitamin A, in which 1 cup of pasteurized milk can reach about 17% of the recommended daily vitamin A concentrations. And then studies have reported that pasteurization only slightly reduces vitamins B2, B12, and BE, but then 1 cup of pasteurized milk can meet about 40% of vitamin B2 daily recommendations and 48% of vitamin B12 recommendations. However, these vitamins can also be easily obtained through other diet sources like eggs, meat, vegetables, as well as nuts and seeds. Now, moving on to other parameters of milk composition. Pasteurization is said to, or has shown to, only significantly reduce the fat concentrations of milk, specifically the fatty acids, butyric, caproic, and caprylic acids. Now, there is inconsistent evidence when it comes to proteins, or specifically whey proteins, where some studies have reported that pasteurization significantly reduces these concentrations, whereas others have found no change at all. Now, a study looking into the health benefits, or the potential health benefits, of raw milk consumption in children have found that specific whey proteins like bovine serum albumin, alpha-lactalbumin, and beta-lactoglobulin, as well as raw milk consumption, was inversely associated with asthma, hay fever, and respiratory tract infections. The studies also reported that these health effects were only effective in children that were fed raw milk early in life, so either in utero through their mother's consumption or during infancy. I also want to point out that the children used in these studies were raised on farms or from rural areas in countries across Europe. So it is important to look at the potential farm effect. And so research has shown that children that are raised on farms are healthier in terms of reduced allergies and asthma rates as compared to children raised in cities or suburban areas. And this is likely due to the diverse microbial and environmental exposures. Now, in addition to the effects on consumers, raw milk is also shown to economically affect producers, as this is a niche market where prices are considered relatively stable and profits potentially higher. And so a conventional dairy farmer may make around $2 per gallon of fluid milk produced, whereas a raw for retail farmer can potentially make up to $10 per gallon. And so I've applied these prices to a high-producing dairy cow, Jersey dairy cow, which can produce around 2,000 gallons of milk annually. And so a conventional dairy farmer may make up to around $4,000 per cow. However, a raw for retail dairy farmer could potentially make up to $20,000 per cow. But it is important to note that any farmers that are considering switching over to the raw for retail sector may need to implement investment costs, as their farms and milking facilities will most likely need to be either remodeled or upgraded so that they can meet these high sanitary standards and to pay for daily milk testing to ensure the safety of their raw milk for consumers. Now, lastly, I would like to briefly touch on pre-weaned calf feeding, as in the dairy industry, it is most common to feed waste milk to these calves, as waste milk is not allowed for human consumption because it is most likely from sick cows that are currently being treated with antibiotics or from cows that have recently calved. And so this milk likely can contain higher abundances of pathogens and viruses as well as antibiotic residues. And so some studies found that when feeding pasteurized colostrum and waste milk to pre-weaned dairy calves, they showed increased body weights and average daily gain, lower morbidity and mortality rates, and a lower abundance of antimicrobial resistant genes within their guts. And so to conclude this presentation, there is an overall shared risk when it comes to raw milk. So not only is it a health risk for humans and calves, but it can also be a market risk, as some farms that have raw milk outbreaks may face financial losses as well as losing the trust of their consumers. Now, in the future, more research is needed. So research needs to address the potential health benefits of raw milk, and we also need to look for ways to disinfect milk while protecting the full nutritional composition of the raw milk. And so I would like to conclude this presentation with a quote from Henry Alvord written in 1899, which states that no branch of agriculture has made greater progress than dairying during the 19th century. It is now regarded as among the most progressive and highly developed forms of farming in the United States. Now, I think this quote raises an important question. Does this resurgence of raw milk reflect continued progress, or are we taking a step back into the past? Thank you.
Great job, Jalyn. We'll take about 5 minutes for questions.
So the last quote's really interesting. Do you think that the progression in the dairy industry and what people see as the industrialization of the dairy industry has led people to distrust the processed milk, like the pasteurized milk that we're producing? And how can we combat their misconceptions of our industry that are causing that distrust?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I definitely think that kind of going back to that post-COVID-19 thoughts, I think some people are moving towards more natural, which is why people are kind of leading towards, purchasing milk from pasture-based dairies. So as a whole, I think people are steering away from the industrialization of the dairy industry. But I do think that, with continued education and promoting, the industrialization is to keep sanitary conditions pretty high, that could potentially help. And then also, not to throw your research out there, but for the industrialization of the dairy industry to also look into also offering, some pasture access to, increase consumers wanting to still purchase milk from, highly intensive dairy farms.
Hey, Jamie, I have two questions. One for human health and one for animal health. What's the risk for those susceptible populations of consuming cheese made with unpasteurized milk, if there's any?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the risk for calves that are fed unpasteurized waste milk?
So for the humans consuming, cheese and additional dairy products, I'm not exactly sure the rate itself, but I did, when I introduced the Raw Farm company, those outbreaks weren't just from fluid milk, but it was also linking back to creams, butter, and cheeses. So I still believe that the risk is I don't want to say that it's the same or higher or lower, but there is still risk there because it's not just, raw fluid milk that is causing illnesses. It can also be, the additional dairy products. And when it comes to calves, I do think you could potentially look at it as the farm effect, but in calves. And so they may not be as affected if you were to apply this to babies or infants drinking raw milk. But just pathogens itself can, definitely cause illness in calves. So I really don't know the exact rate, but I do believe that, there is still risk. So either pasteurization or milk replacer, or even feeding like bulk tank milk, even though it's not pasteurized, it still may be safer for calves as compared to simply just raw waste milk.
Have you found any research on that by chance?
I have briefly seen studies comparing pasteurized milk versus bulk tank milk. I don't believe they saw many differences when it comes to pasteurized milk versus just raw bulk tank milk, but I specifically focused on waste milk just because that's most common in the dairy industry, and it doesn't take away any profits. So I focused on it just simply because that's the majority of what farmers use. I feel like less of them are using bulk tank milk because they can use that milk to then make money selling it to human consumption.
Even though it's not consumed, are raw milk soaps still spreading the viruses?
That is a great question. I'm really not familiar with soaps at all. I know goat milk soap is pretty popular. I haven't necessarily heard of cow milk soap. I believe it could contaminate, maybe. I'm not sure though if the chemicals that are added when it comes to making soap could potentially disinfect the bacteria that are present. So I would definitely need to look into that further.
So I find it ironic that you put up a slide there with the raw farm that has 4 outbreaks of E. coli within the last year, or 4 different bacteria, but it caused hemolytic uremic syndrome. You think back to 1993, when one food chain revolutionized the meat industry because of HUS and children. And so from 1993 through 1998, we went through a series of implementation of HACCP plans to look at physical, microbiological, and chemical hazards in meat. We increased the recommended cooking temperature to 165. At what point in time does milk create that same scare among USDA and CDC and the constituents?
I think that's a great question. Specifically going back to that farm as an example, he was actually speaking in that Netflix documentary. So if you are curious, I would suggest, looking at that episode. But the CEO did state that it was honestly just kind of an unfortunate mistake.
It was an unfortunate mistake for Jack in the Box too.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure, honestly, what it would take. Hopefully not more children becoming ill, but I hate to say that that's probably what will have to happen, especially due to more new age consumers wanting this natural, great product that processing's bad for the body, things like that. So we'll have to, I hate to say, but I think it will need more outbreaks to cause additional scares for raw milk consumption.
I didn't realize the raw milk craze. I've heard it, but I didn't realize it was so mainstream.
Have you looked at any of the consumer data for people who are for partial processing, like some farms that we have here in Mississippi that will market non-homogenized milk, but that is still pasteurized for a lot of similar health benefits? I'm wondering if any of that data has been lumped in with any of this.
I honestly have not. The data that I've included, the milk was homogenized first and then pasteurized. It was kind of following just the basic processing plant protocols. So I'm really not sure if homogenization, the lack of it, would cause, changes in either, risk or potentially taste, things like that. But that is interesting to look into. But for the sake of this presentation, I didn't see any research looking into kind of like smaller dairy farms leading to this type of processing.
So, as a dairy producer, what do you think it would take for us to kind of win back the consumer with the support of the policies and everything like that, being for raw milk, kind of everything leaning towards that? We're not making as much on per cow basis or per gallon basis. How do we move forward and not just be kind of overshadowed by the raw milk consumption?
I think the first, biggest answer is just education, letting consumers know that, which technically we still don't fully know, is raw milk, much healthier compared to pasteurized milk. So I think a lot of that comes on the processing side. We need to figure out, does pasteurization, kind of ruin certain parts of raw milk? Also, just research. Of the research that I've presented in terms of humans consuming raw milk, none of that has been done in America, because I think American researchers are wary of, feeding raw milk to subjects, because then they could potentially become sick. So we need research and we need more education, but that could also be added to kind of Sierra's question on, we're so industrialized, right? So we could potentially be a little bit less, offering pasture more often, in terms of, instead of just being during maternity leave, we could offer like half and half. Like our maternity farm, they can come in and out whenever they want. That would potentially, make consumers feel better, because even they don't know, I guess, that these dairy cows living in free stalls, they think it's potentially harmful and not natural. And so they might feel better if we give them pasture access. So then they may potentially, start buying, industrialized milk again. So I think there's a lot of components that could lead to that.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? All right, let's.
Thank you.